Hi, Mishaco, and really thankful for Jay popping in last time to help review the AP53. That went really well, and also thanks for all the comments and encouragement on that. But this video, we're going to do something different. Been doing a lot of German guns lately, and as I come out to the cabin this time, I'm kind of in an American mood. I brought a few American rifles, pistols. But you know, one thing that Jay, you might kind of guess it by his username now being Jay's Blades, really likes knives, swords, bayonets. So this video, as the title alludes to, we're going to talk about the US M3 fighting knife. Combat knife, but definitely not utility knife. Really interesting, and I know these kinds of videos don't get a huge number of views, and that's okay, very niche, but if you could support it, that'd be great, because this is just something I felt like doing. And maybe I'll make one on the M4 bayonet / fighting knife and go from there if you guys want to. But today, we're going to talk about this. Little change of pace. And this is a relatively early example with a relatively rare scabbard. And before we pop her open, along with some other examples here, please, if you'd like to help support the channel, I know it gets old, but YouTubers are not wealthy. YouTube does not pay what you think, especially on bayonet videos. But you know what? I've always wanted to do this channel. And Jay, when he was here, wanted to do this channel on stuff we liked, enjoyed, not what anyone said we had to do. And like I said, I just kind of felt like going here today. It was a good time. The M3. Really the first of a generation featuring this blade style, dagger type, and in some ways this grip, although it does change quite a bit. It was highly influential, but on the other hand, it was in production for under 2 years. And while it saw use as late as Vietnam, right after D-Day, it became a substitute or limited issue standard. In World War I, I don't have one to show you, there were a couple of fighting knives. You had the 1917, you had the more effective Mark I, the trench knife with the knuckle dusters. And that's really where this starts here. They quit making those before World War II, and we're just using up stockpiles. But even before the war, they realized we need something. And that's the Army. The Marines, under the Navy, also needed something. That would end up the Mark II, the K-bar, which was a fighting knife and utility knife. And that was under consideration for the Army, because in 1941, they were trying this whole new concept of guys falling out of planes with some bed sheets tied to them. Yeah, paratroopers. And after Pearl Harbor, by 1942, they're getting serious about paratroopers. They really need to give them a knife, and other folks not issued a rifle with a bayonet lug. So at this time, the brand new M1 carbine, also the 1928 A1 Thompson, M1 Thompson, eventually the M3 grease gun, maybe even the 1918 BAR, never seen that, but, could be as well. And you have some other special forces, or as they were known during World War II, shock troops, or shock forces, like the Army Rangers needing a fighting knife, a combat knife. So what was designed in 1942 at Imperial is this. It has a 6 3/4 blade with an edge here and a half edge here, inspired by the Mark I trench knife, but not the same. It has a very straightforward cross guard till you get to the thumb rest, grooved leather grip, and then a pommel threaded on the end. It was designed from the outset to be slim and lightweight, especially when in the scabbard, something that the paratroopers requested, and also something that, the Ordnance Department was happy about, because it was also designed to not use up critical materials, metals, steels, brass, alloys, so use as little resources as possible, be light as possible, and be set up for mass production. The downside, this is just a fighting knife, a combat knife. So it and the Scabbard were the two major competitors. The earliest testing was in December of 42. Happened quite quickly. This was selected by the Army because they could get a lot of them in the field faster, and it just did what they needed. Designed at Imperial, they were also the first maker and the largest maker of these. And already by March of 1943, they were not only in full production, but they were just starting to get handed out to paratroopers and rangers. And it would not be long until other makers came on board. This one here, as best I can recall, remember blind, is Case. They came later than Imperial, but they were still one of the earlier makers. Camillus was another early maker. And ultimately, 9 companies would receive contracts to assemble these during World War II. With so many going into the field so quickly, being used so heavily, design changes would begin. You might think, in hindsight, they didn't make these for very long. As I said, they're pretty uniform. And in some ways, yes, but in other ways, they're a lot of fun to collect because you have tons of variation. Let's start with maybe the most obvious, the Scabbard. This is the original M6 Scabbard. Obviously, it is stitched, riveted leather. It does have metal here to keep it from poking through and hurting the guy. It does have a hole in the bottom where you could tie a strap. It was rawhide. And it does have a metal hanger on top to connect with the 1910 web gear, mostly the ammo carriers. And then, of course, it has a slide here for a belt. This was actually designed specifically for the M3 by the Barwood Manufacturing Company and was put into production in 1943. A few other companies were also contracted to make these. It didn't last long, because already by the mid to later part of that year, this Scabbard came along. The M8. And by early 44, it was replacing the M6. By the way, the M7 was a M1 Grand Scabbard. But this M8 Scabbard, it's a fiberglass material. Basically, it's cotton and polymers mixed together, resin, and it has a steel throat, painted usually, and a canvas hanger. Now, originally, the M8 did not have the metal here, just the canvas, because the thought was, well, these were being issued to troops that did not have a rifle that would, use that carrier. Even though it started off as paratroopers and the like, soon it would go to other shock troops that needed these. And I think one kind of cool user were the Army Air Corpsmen. And as more and more of these were available by 1944, officers, NCOs, and the like would get them. They were out there. And that actually helped here. With this, it's a much cheaper and also more durable scabbard and more flexible. Like I said, by 1944, the M8 was in production. This was actually designed at the Beckwith Manufacturing Company, who set up Victory Plastics to make the actual polymer, or well, I should say fiberglass plastic scabbard, and BM would make the throats here. I don't know who made the canvas. So BM and VP would be the markings on these. But by mid-44, again with feedback from the field, you would get the M8A1, which had further improvements. Namely, they extended out the frog here, the hanger, and they added the metal. Now, some like this one, it's there, but it was stitched on after the fact. In fact, a lot of original M8s received that later. And just to make things even more confusing, using up old parts that were already stamped M8, some that came out of the factory as M8A1s are still just marked M8s. It doesn't matter. The point is, we have 3 scabbards in World War II. The M6, lightweight, but not all that durable, using leather, prone to rot and retaining moisture. There was a lot of other leather gear early in the war, but it's getting dropped. This is why already that summer they were starting to replace these. No one knows exactly when production ended. I've seen fall of 43 as being the earliest, maybe winter of 44 latest. We don't even know how many were made because a lot of them don't survive because, again, leather. At least 200,000 to 250 are the most common estimates. Some sources say maybe as many as 300,000. That sounds like a lot, but it's not. Leather deteriorates. And compared to the M8, M8A1 that are still in service today, it's nothing. Speaking of the M8, these were in at least limited production by the summer of 1943. And were made through the summer of 1944, give or take. Some, early April to June, spring, summer. But in that relatively short period, they still managed to turn out about 1.7 million. And then when the A1 came about, made from April of 1944 through August of 1945, so war's end, they made over 3.1 million. So all 3 types together, roughly 5 million scabbards. I know you're just super interested in this, but it is kind of cool because the M8A1 just became the U.S. scabbard forever, including today. But enough about that. What about the pokey thing? Back to our relatively early example here, and we know this because of the markings on the blade. Early ones were marked with the type, M3, the maker. Again, I think case in this instance. It could be Camelus, but I think it's case. And the date, 1943. As it happens, that would be the only date we saw on these, because by 1944, and it could have happened in 43, we just wouldn't know, but they would drop the date. So sometime in 43, leading into 44, the date was dropped, leaving the blade simply with the model and maker there. Next, the markings would move from the blade to the crossguard, the hilt, whatever. Now, some makers, like Utica, who came on later, even though they made quite a large number, only ever marked them here. So there are basically 3 different styles of marking. Now, some say they switch from the blade stamping to the crossguard stamping because stamping it on the blade itself actually weakened it. I don't know about that, but I can definitely see how this is an easier way to go. So, makes sense. You can also see how being marked on the blade, if you're going to be using it, rubbing it, it's well stamped, but yeah, it makes perfect sense. Speaking of the blade, relatively shiny blue with essentially a half edge or a false edge here, full size here. Another blue, even a little bit shinier on this one. And then our other one over here phosphated. Now, some sources say they just, did phosphating and bluing concurrently. They definitely started off originally as blued, and then they went to phosphating. Now, did they completely switch over, or did some of the makers, because there were 9 in total, still keep bluing? I really don't know. Doesn't really matter. The time period's so brief. But I do know that they switched to phosphating because it was faster, easier to apply, and absolutely more corrosion resistant compared with bluing. So those are, I guess, the most obvious changes and updates to the design. But wait, there's more. The pommel was originally threaded on, but soon, at least some of the makers would go to just pinning it on. And that styling can be different just depending on how each factory did it. So that I would point that out, that the attachment method for the pommel changed. The grips also changed, but I don't know if it was so much a design change as much as it was just each kind of company doing its thing. What I can tell you for sure is the M3 left the factory with leather grips. Grooved here, the number of grooves, the depth of grooves can change, but they were all leather. Some sources say there were a few with smooth leather grips. I don't know. Wood was never original though, I can tell you that. The leather, it was lacquered and polished. And it does seem like later ones were a little thicker in the hand. Early ones seem to be a little slimmer. Then again, it could just be a manufacturing difference. So, how did this do in the field? Pros, cons, and why was it in production for such a brief period of time? From the Army staff's point of view, it did exactly what it was supposed to. It was light, it was cost effective, they were able to really turn these out. And soldiers also agreed. It is light. They thought the quality of the blade was good for what it was. Good thrusting dagger type weapon. And well balanced. Even so well balanced that some soldiers with time on their hands got practiced at using it as a throwing knife. Let me demonstrate. No, I'm not going to throw this. It's a relatively early rare variant. But anyway, yeah, so that's the good things. The not so good. It's not a utility knife. It specifically says it in the manual. That didn't stop soldiers from using it for other things. Opening up food tins, ammo crates, I don't know, using it as a toothpick. They were bending and breaking this blade left and right. It is thin, by design. They also found that not the easiest to keep sharp and in good shape in the field than anything else. Also, it was a combat knife, but really more of a combat dagger. It wasn't good at cutting things. It doesn't have a sawtooth, and it wasn't good at slashing. And if you tried to do anything on the backhand, if you didn't catch the front edge and you hit here, well, there's no cutting thing. By the way, the reason they left this spine here was for strength, because if they had given it an edge all the way down, they felt that it would just be too flimsy. So not only was it only for fighting, it was really only for a couple of styles of fighting and not all. But nevertheless, it was cheap and lightweight, and it is attractive. The leather grip fits the hand very well, frankly. Feels good in the hand. But of course, it is leather, and over time, it will deteriorate and rot, especially if it's not stored properly. This explains why some M3s you find today have wood replacements, or this thing I teased at the beginning of the video. Yeah, we'll get there. And it seems like the phosphating was definitely a very happy thing. Mid-44 and production was at its height. Also at its height, right around D-Day, June of 1944, its replacement was accepted into service. The M4 bayonet for the M1 carbine, which looks suspiciously a lot like the M3. And, in fact, was meant to be used as a fighting knife if a bayonet lug was not available. Which kind of means that while we can say that these were taken out of production, the last contract was fulfilled in August of 1944, meaning the run was like 18 months in total. In a way, it just morphed into a new knife, new blade. This depends on how you look at it. 9 makers did it. Imperial made over 850,000. Utica was another high maker of over 650, with Camillus over 400,000, and Case coming in at over 300,000. Actually, just about as many as the M6 Scabbards. The rest of the makers from there, a couple of them made 150,000, and then you have a few small makers that made 50,000 or less, probably later on. From there, obviously there are a ton of M8, M8A1s. This is one without the metal reinforcement here. Fun fact, an easy way to tell an early M8A1 from a later production one is the direction of the closure, like which side overlaps the other. And but you know, being fiberglass and everything, they're used interchangeably all the dang time. But they would definitely not just pave the way to the M1 carbine bayonet, the M4, but the whole family, including the M7 and all of its derivatives that are still in use today for the AR, M16, M4. That actually gets us to this interesting modern day creation, including this interesting scabbard. You might first think it's a M3, but with a reverse crossguard. But you look at this here, and it's all one piece with a almost like a wood screw. It's definitely a Phillips head screw in the bottom. But technically, this is Army surplus because it actually was shredded in by a soldier at a surplus store. So he carried it. It's light. It has a good balance point. I'll give it that. But the butt on it, I don't know how durable that'd be. But it's a legacy. Now, that's a funky reproduction. I will say that the Ontario Knife Company did make a pretty nice M3 fighting knife reproduction, leather grips included. And I believe that the Camillus name has been bought and started over by a new company as well to kind of continue the legacy. But no, Ontario was not an original World War II maker of... I don't know. I just felt like talking about something a little different today, guys. What do you think, if you're still here? They're fun to collect. And I have to give credit to my friend Jerry for helping out with this video. Voluntarily, I didn't ask him. He offered. That's actually where this one came from. That's why I was joking about throwing it earlier. But if everyone wants to sell it, I'd take it. But no, it's just a fun thing to do. And as he pointed out, you know, you can collect a lot of nice bayonets for just what 1 or 2 guns cost. But it was a nice day after all the rains we had. I felt like sitting out in the yard, talking with you guys. Just took Miss Peanut to the vet for a checkup. Good news is, she's doing great. Bad news is, she's pissed at me. So I thought I just better come out here and let her cool off. She's definitely a girl. She acts like it every time. So let me know if you'd like to see a sequel to this on the M4 that took over from the M3 and that whole transition period, and we can do her. And for what it's worth, he doesn't post a lot of videos because time, but you know, check out Jay's Blades channel there because he definitely knows a lot more about knives and metallurgy to that than I do. So yeah, I'm just a casual hobbyist here. With that, I appreciate you hanging out on this kind of impromptu video. If you could, check out Patreon or drop a comment and tell me about your interesting fighting knives of U.S. vintage history. And also, as always, like, share, and subscribe. It costs you nothing. It helps out small channels like this one immensely, more than you know, because of the way YouTube does things. This is Misha, and I'll catch you when Peanut's no longer mad at me very soon next time.